Now, I would first ask Ali, would you please like to talk a little bit about what it means by poetry and what it means by identity, if I ask you? How do you connect both?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be on a panel with you. For me, I suppose I approach poetry from two sides of the brain. One is that, of course, I write poetry, but the other is I study it as a historical archive. And that's what I do in my latest book. So what I look at is the space of poetry, the mushaira, as part of the public sphere and the various publics that are part of it. And of course, I look at Urdu poetry and Persian poetry. Identity itself is a modern concept. So it emerges out of the rise of the nation state and so on and so forth. So for a large part of history, poetry has often been about, in particularly Urdu poetry, uses the images of mysticism. But of course, there are undercurrents and underlayers of all kinds of insurrectionary and revolutionary sort of questioning. And you find this, 700 years ago, for example, if you look at a poet like Fakhruddin Iraqi writing in the 13th century, most people today, when it comes to Muslims, they will know Ibn Taymiyyah because of his famous fatwa about the killing of non-Muslims and so on. But in the same century, there was this amazing Persian poet who wrote ghazals questioning orthodox organized religion. So he says, "Batawaf Kaaba raftam baraham raham nadadan ke birun dar che kardi ke darun khana ai be qamar khana raftam hama pak baz didam chub suma rasidam hama yaftam riyai." So it's a long poem, but he says, I went to the Kaaba in order to do the circumambulation and I was not allowed in. And a voice called out to me and said, "Who are you to enter these walls after what you have done?" And then I went to the gambling house and all I saw were pure souls. And then I went to the religious ceremony and all I saw were abstaining hypocrites. So you see, this is definitely not secular poetry. It would be, unfortunately, a lot of people would read it like that. But within religious tradition, because the poet basically questions. And the poet reflects aspects of society, holds a mirror up to society. And so I think Urdu poetry in particular, because of its genealogy with Persian and Arabic poetry and the very formal aspect of poetry, because of course now we have free verse and so on. Nazm, as most of you might know, is a new, again, genre relatively, but the ghazal is the one which has a history of almost 2,000 years. So there are continuities, disruptions. The poet acts almost as an insurrectionary voice. And in the modern age, of course, the poet threatens those who hold authority. One man or one woman can hold an entire government hostage, and that's the power of the poet.
Thank you. And I would also like to remember Sughra Humayun Mirza of Hyderabad, who was a woman who used poetry to bring women together, and gatherings were happening behind Pardha. And there is a Sughra Humayun Mirza school not far from this place. And now I would like you to respond, Chandramohan, a little bit.
So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for this unique opportunity to speak my mind. So on the question of identity, I would like to first say that identity is some kind of something that is ascribed on people by the larger society, and something out of which he or she will not be able to escape out. It's a kind of shadow. So and also on top of that, if these identities are contested and these individuals protest against identity, then that is another, that's a form of contested identity. Secondly, what in my opinion is the crux of literature and identity is that, in my opinion, for a person, for a poet, for a writer, for anybody, there is this intersectionality in the sense that he is also a Dalit and also a person who of a particular unique social circumstances that he cannot wish away with. For example, an Afro-American person also being gay, or something like that, in which he is combating multiple marginalities simultaneously. So that makes our this very panel with one woman and two men of various marginalized identities even more interesting. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Number second, I used to call myself a Dalit poet writing in English. You all may be knowing that Indian English poetry Indian English poetry, I believe, has a relatively shorter history compared to the Bhasha counterparts. And the Indian English poetry has remained very urban-centric. Yeah. Indian English poetry has remained very urban-centric, upper classist and upper casteist. And there are only a handful of Muslim names who've made it big in poetry, who've registered their voice. So I used to perceive myself as having two extreme polarities of privilege and deprivation simultaneously. So a nomenclature like Indian English Dalit poet, the term Dalit would describe as a perception, as a social circumstance of extreme disadvantage and access to English language. Having the good fortune to converse in English, to write in English, and to be maybe considered a poet worthy of serious scrutiny, that itself is a very unique vantage point to articulate your feelings.
I think though we are sitting like this, one person who's talking about, an identity which is an Islamic identity, a Dalit identity, and I am a woman. So are these identities so clearly discriminated or deviated, or don't we have more? Am I able to represent Dalit women voices or Muslim women voices? And as men, the two of you, what is your position of being men and talking about certain things? What happens when you represent certain community or certain identities?
I don't think I consciously ever write as a man, though of course subconsciously that is always there. And one has to often question oneself if one is taking certain things for granted. As far as metaphysical poetry is concerned, which I'm quite interested in, it blurs the boundaries between gender. If you look at the history of Persian poetry, if you look at the history of Urdu poetry, when the lover is talking to the beloved, it really, the beauty of poetry, of course, is that it speaks in many registers, and it has a freedom inbuilt within it for it to be understood by people from very different backgrounds. So if you look at the life of a poem, of course, it emerges from a certain point of time in the poet's mind. But the most successful, the most acclaimed poetry is often that which resonates with an audience that perhaps it didn't even intend to engage with initially. So I think, of course, there is a need to speak about these marginalized identities. And there's a lot of poetry that is written about the oppression of women, about oppression of ethnicities, about caste, religion, and so on. I often find the most powerful poems actually written, I've read some of Chandramohan Bhai's poetry, not much, but some. And for instance, his poetry about Islamophobia is very powerful. And it's powerful we were just speaking about if one didn't know whether he wrote it, whether one would assume it's written by a Muslim. That's actually the key question. And perhaps he'll read that poem for us also. So, I think the poet actually has the ability not only to engage with identity, but also use poetry to transcend identity. And I think that's probably the most powerful and successful kind of poetry that has been there.
See, as a person from Kannada scenario, I would now like to bring in the Vachana period of the 12th century, which also allowed people to sustain their identity, and also in a way, it merged as a philosophical aspect, Vachanas are Vachanas, they are not poems. Later on, literary history called them as poems, and Ramanujan translated 4 or 5 Vachanakaras. There are many of them who also talk about themselves, and if you call it as a poem or call it as poetry, then it also allows people to talk about their identities, at the same time stand on equal standards with power. Would you please like to read the poem?
So before I read the poem, I'd like to say a few, I'd like to speak my mind on this, a person who's perceived to be of a privileged identity from the perspective of a particular issue. He or she is not, in the contemporary setting, not allowed to engage with or air his views confidently on what transpires now. So I have few observations on that. Firstly, is that suppose people who have not undergone that trauma, they write about situations, such situations. I would believe that, I would urge, or I would aspire that this person has a tendency to sensitively engage with the voices that come from within the community. That's all I ask for. So I'll read my poem. So the poem is titled 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Burkini. So this poem was written when Burkini was banned in France. So I believe most of you know what Burkini is. So Burkini is a swimwear used by Muslim women in the beaches. So it was banned in Paris and in France, and then there were it was perceived as a very overt Islamophobic act to ban hijab or any kind of headdress in public places, and there was widespread protests and whatever. So the person who designed, the fashion designer who designed this particular garment, had this famous quote about Burkini. Her name is Aheda Saniti. She had this statement: "I created the Burkini to give women freedom, not to take it away. I created the Burkini to give women freedom, not to take it away." 13 ways of looking at a black Burkini. 1. Burkini is a language terrifying those ignorant of its text. Burkini is a language terrifying those ignorant of its text. Second, cops patrol her tan lines like dams patrol rivers flowing above danger marks. Cops patrol her tan lines like dams patrolling rivers flowing above danger marks. 3. All you need is in that bag. Change into a garment more palatable for cops in uniform. 4. Some garments cling too close to your surname, like a metaphor too loud for good poetry. Some garments cling too close to your surname, like a metaphor too loud for good poetry. 5. Sea surfing can be tiring, like an infinite ebb and flow of a questionnaire. Batting an eyelid can be a tad too immodest. 6. Tether yourself close to the beach. Do not surf too deep into the ocean. Never self-intersect in circles of knots and tangles. 7. Bruises sustained from frisking metamorphose into festering wounds. Gangrene could gnaw at them. 8. Erase your footprints from the sands. Waves of time rarely wash the footprints of a scuffle. Prolonged scuffle can bury us all in our deep hole. 9. Do you remember the first corpse the sea sucked off a turbulent beach? The sea spat it out after 3 days of frisking. 10. The footprints of a scuffle implicate you from shore to shore, blowing up all the bridges between you and anyone. 11. During this conversation, some territory has been ceded across the tan lines of your body. 12. Your body, stripped off the garment, remains an evacuated language, Can a language be a scarecrow? 13. History will catch up with you in your rear view mirror, even if you're full throttle in your pursuit of happiness. History will catch up with you in your rear view mirror, even if you're full throttle in your pursuit of happiness. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. It's a beautiful poem. And the next thing I would like to ask both of you is, there are certain identities that are thrust on you, forced on you. And there are some that we claim, which are not allowed to. And would you like to talk a little bit about the differences of these identities, how you deal with it? Is there anything that you want to say that certain things are thrust upon you, certain things do you want to claim, and how poetry and politics have always come hand in hand together, all through whatever historical juncture you see, you know. So now I would like to ask you to, would you like to just...
I mean, I think for a poet and a successful poet, when it comes to politics, when it comes to identity and therefore it comes to politics, the most important thing is oppression as an idea and an engagement with oppression. So if you look at, and therefore you are inevitably going to be speaking from the point of view of an identity where you have Agha Shahid Ali in Kashmir, Mahmoud Darwish in Palestine, I mean Faiz in Pakistan, Habib Jalib in Pakistan, a number of poets. And so you can't quite escape it, and I think successful poets are those who are able to be in solidarity with that oppression. You know, for example,
do you feel any of the identities have been thrust upon you?
I think it's inevitable. The state, first of all, as soon as you're born...
What do you want to claim? Is there anything
I'd rather not have any identity. But one always needs to have an identity, because that legally, firstly, you need it to survive, to work your way through the labyrinth of bureaucracy and legal institutions. And society, I mean, this is a philosophical debate that goes back centuries, right? Are we the product of ourselves, or are we the products of how society shapes us? It's the famous master-slave dialectic. And we can't, even in this secular age, we can't escape othering, right? This is the fundamental problem with, if we look at poetry, if we look at philosophy, and of course, for me, poetry is true philosophy, which philosophers might have a problem with, but really, truly, if you look at poetry, it truly serves the purpose of philosophy. Philosophy, analytical philosophy, has got very wrapped up in logic and frameworks and word games and so on. But if you look at the great systems that have emerged over the centuries, it's often poets that have acted as the translators of those systems. So identity is always thrust upon you. And if you, again, to go back to the metaphysical poetry, the entire aspect, there's a famous, again, Persian poem by the poet Bedil from the 18th century, he was from Afghanistan. He says, اسیر الفت خود کن گرفتار دو عالم رنگم از بیرحمی نازت اسیر الفت خود کن اگر میخواهی آزادی. I am trapped in between these two worlds, and I am completely engulfed in the mercilessness of your compassion, of course addressing God. The secret to happiness is to become a prisoner of your own happiness. If you truly want to be free, become a prisoner of your own happiness. So you see there's almost a paradox which is presented, and inevitably these are paradoxes. And the best poets, much like the Bhakti tradition or the Sufi tradition, Sikhi, they exactly try and make you transcend these identities. Of course, one needs to speak in order to recognize the oppression, but then one also needs to transcend.
Would you also like to respond? And one thing I would also want to ask you is, as an individual, as a poet, you are not just isolated from a community. When you are attached to a community and also a person who is writing, So how would you connect yourself with the community, and how does your identity represent the community, or the community represents your stake as a poet?
Yeah, first of all, to answer the question how the community represents, or I represent my community, is that probably there is a dearth of people who articulate in English from the Dalit community. So maybe I fit in to a certain extent. So, in that way, I'll be considered as somebody who is from within the community, and also who can speak to some kind of an audience that is very much close to the discourse. That's one. Number second, being a Dalit poet, I think, in my opinion, see, in the world of art, in the literary ecosystem, one's own one's own lack of one's own disadvantages, one's own social circumstances that are of pain, they become sources of poetry. So I would call these some kind of epistemological privilege, that a person who was forced to, like, what is it, emigrate out of his hearth, or whose very existence is considered, like, I don't know, demeaning, denigrating. He can use those I don't know, scars that he has on his soul to write poetry that can, I don't know, rupture the whatever that is, the history, lineage of poetry, literary history of poetry. That's number one. Number second, it is generally suppose if I were to comment on ideas that are identities that are thirst upon you, and the resultant identity politics later on. There are these examples of words like slut walk. So the word slut acquires a newer connotation, a very assertive feminist connotation. Recently, though somebody being called a slut is like derogatory, and it doesn't have a male equivalent. Masculine equivalent. Maybe it has. I don't know. Maybe I'm not aware enough. This word has assertive connotations. Today there is something called slut walk. So similarly, there is Mia poetry. So generally, I don't know, the word Mia may be, I don't know, innocuous, but in Assam or some places, it is a slur. It's a slur to mean that you don't belong here, that you are from Bangladesh or whatever that is. Okay, so but then there is a branch of poetry, a rivulet of poetry, that is called Mia poetry today. So the stones thrown at you become your weapons as you think creatively. Yeah.
Okay, now the next one is, then how do you use poetry as a social tool, and how do you use, what are the specific elements? Would you like to refer to certain things? What do you represent? What are these kinds of things? Where did it come from? Like, it's also region specific, right? It's not just caste, also is not homogeneous. Even the Dalits or are not homogeneous. So would you like to share a little bit about specifically what kind of, how your poetry, how do you use poetry as a social tool as such? Your poems, for example.
Yeah, so I come from Kerala. So Kerala, which is the land of Malayalis, will have a long tradition of resistance against Brahminical oppression. So we have this, I think, a poet by name Poigil Apachan, who had these two lines which imply Kanannule Raksharavum Ende Vamshatte Patti, Kananundu Anegam Vamshathin Charitrangal, which means not a single alphabet on my race. Invisible are the traces of my race. Innumerable are the tales of many races. This is the couplet. It's like, there is no alphabet on my race, but there are many on many races. Yeah. So in English it can be like this: invisible are the traces of my race. Innumerable are the tales of many races. So that's one aspect of it. Number second, in today's world, if a Dalit poet writes a poem, quote unquote a poem, it by in itself is a documentation. It's a documentation of a process, or a documentation of some kind of process, that we too exist in this society. So the very act that you have written a poem and you're articulate about those particular causes that your specific identity represent, and you are very much culturally entrenched in that society, Your very poem is an act of resistance, that you wrote this. Because there is this line of argumentation in intellectual history that the relative social asymmetry between two communities is directly proportional to their share in history writing. So the act of history writing.
You please like to continue this and talk about the contemporary times, contemporary writing, and you as a writer, and what is your politics, your poetry and politics?
My poetry and my politics. So maybe I'll read out one small poem and then a slightly longer one, and that'll tell you my politics and perhaps something about how I question identity also. So the first one, a few weeks ago I met an MP, BJP MP, who told me that, you know, Muslims are the most secure community in India, very seriously. So I said, I don't know who told you this. He said, the Prime Minister told me this. So I said, okay. So anyway, there was a back and forth, and then he said, it looks like you have a lot of ghubar, you have a lot of dust or dirt in your heart. And I will clean it for you, don't worry, just spend some time with me. But first tell me, are you Shia or Sunni? Because for those of you who might not know, especially in North India, I don't know about the South, the BJP has been trying to use sectarian divides within the Muslim community in order for their own gain. So the Sufis and the Shias are the good Muslims, the Salafis, the Sunnis are the bad Muslims. So this reminded me of this idea of trusting identity, right? Because here's an MP who's a Bhojpuri actor. I probably don't need to say more than that. I don't need to take any more names. So it says, it's called Your Silence. Your silence, adorned by deceit, laced with conceit, is bathed in the blood of innocence. Why don't you speak? Your silence has no dignity. All this talk of unity is colored by the hypocrisy of thoughts and deeds. Why don't you speak? Your silence broken for a brother in faith but no other. Where is your humanity? Why don't you speak? Your silence condones the slaughter of innocent sisters, mothers and daughters. I'll say it louder. Why don't you speak? Your silence offends me when all you judge by is Shia or Sunni, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh and Masihi. A life is a life. Why don't you speak? Masihi is Christian in Arabic. So this is one thing, and I know we're running short of time. So I think often one of the things I found living back home in India, I've lived in England and in Syria and America, is that we can often now get so caught up in our own identity. I mean, of course, Muslims and Islamophobia is much wider, but we can get caught up so much in the local that we now don't talk about the global anymore. So this is just something I wrote, and I think it'll speak quite clearly about my politics, as you asked. It's called Unbowed. My head might be bloody, but it'll stay unbowed, and my voice will be carried on the back of clouds, and the rain will tell the world that I took a vow never to be silent. I walk alone in the crowd. I walk alone in the crowd is a hadith from the Prophet. Kun fin nas wa la takun minhum. So there are all these references which of course would have to be explained. Never to be silent, I walk alone in the crowd. A life is not a life, it's just a weapon of war, cheaper than the junk sold at a dollar store. Every second of your life scripted by the press corps. And the new world motto is, we just want more. A life is not a life, it's just another statistic, born to be bartered, alive to be twisted. You have no value unless you've been conscripted. Expiry dates are ready, stamped, sealed and listed. The 11th of September 1973, why was popular unity replaced in Chile? Imported dictatorships killed democracy. Why were Chilean companies owned by ITT? The 11th of September 2001, and power still flows from the barrel of a gun. We conjure enemies, Armageddon has begun. Green is the new threat, and the red is undone. The spark was in Tunisia, now the fire's in Wall Street. Every heart is Tahrir, can you hear the drum beat? The counter-revolutionaries dance off beat, and the underground rebels hide like mesquite. People rise up, but the markets push them down, and gentrification changes whole towns. Inconvenient revolutions need to be shut down, because the 1% can't afford meltdown. The weapons industry is manufacturing wars, dumping toxic waste by the ocean shores. The rot has set in, and it's eating at the core. But we'll do nothing, we've seen it all before. The dreams of progress and the illusions of hope, gift wrapped and delivered, they're the modern day dope. Our children live on vouchers, single mothers can't cope, and then they tell us, keep the banks afloat. The clash of civilizations, that's a ticking time bomb, and the Wolfowitz doctrine is the ultimate con. From Baghdad to Caracas, from Kabul to Freetown, everybody raise your voices and let's sing this song. Our heads might be bloody, but they'll stay unbowed, and our voices will be carried on the back of clouds, and the rain will tell the world that they took a vow, never to be silent. We walk alone in the crowd.
Thank you, Ali. Now that we are talking about the next thing I would ask is language and identity, and how does language dominate what identity has to be? Like, you have started writing in English, and you already told that as a Dalit poet, writing in English itself is a privilege, and you have achieved that. We would want you to read a poem which could probably talk about yourself as a poet and how it's important to use the language as such, and what gets translated. You also translate a lot.
So, talking about language and identity, I'm very much inspired by a statement, particular statement. This is actually a statement translated by Jean-Paul Sartre. This particular statement is this: the specific traits of a society correspond exactly to the untranslatable locutions of its language. So there is this, let's say a particular society that I come from, there's a particular utterance in that culture which is beyond translation. And what is specific to his or her very existence is inextricably intertwined with that line of utterance. So the very concept of translation, the act of the translators have a sort of blood in their hands, in the sense that they have, unaware of themselves, indulge in an act of violence. Maybe, maybe it may not be true. But so I'll read a poem which addresses the fact that Dalits, tribals, people of the coastal areas, coastal land, who are engaged in fishing, and Muslims of Kerala have their own dialect. In fact, every community has their own dialect, but these dialects are boons of contention, or these islands become markers of persecution. So when young students, toddlers come to school, so they generally speak Malayalam, which is tinged in the accent of that particular community. And these people, young students, try their best to speak standard Malayalam, and hence pass off in the crowd. Okay, something like acting white, whatever. But that's part one of the situation. Part two is there is now a subsect or a strand of poetry that specifically uses these dialects. For example, there are poets who use tribal dialect in Malayalam. So they write a poem in the tribal dialect. Then they have a standard Malayalam version, translation of the same. And later somebody else can translate it in English. So, but then there is a lot lost in that. But still, they have made those attempts. And a loss of a language, it's like a unique perspective. It's like a unique pair of eyes lost when a person dies. So every language, every dialect has something very unique that adds fertility to, the entire humankind.
Here I would also like to add that in Kannada, when Devanur Mahadeva wrote Kusumabale, it was said that you need a translation in Kannada for that, because it was a Dalit dialect which was used in the novel. I mean, he calls it a novel. It's a long poetry, according to me, And you said you would read a poem.
Yeah. So this poem was written in the context of a tribal young youth who was murdered by non-tribals because he allegedly stored some rice. So it also, also portrays the poverty and whatever the living conditions of the margins of Kerala, where Kerala is supposed to be a state with very high levels of human development indices. A posthumous letter. The poem is titled A Posthumous Letter. The specific traits of a society correspond exactly to the untranslatable locutions of its language. This is from John Paul Sartre's article by name Black Orpheus. It was translated by a guy named John Macomb. So there was this negritude poetry, poetry of West African poets in the French language, in the Francophone world. And Sartre wrote an introduction to it. And there is this particular sentence in that, which rings so true. Yeah, so true in my part. So I'll read the poem quickly. A posthumous letter. I am a primate dwelling in the wild forests of my language. My tongue, lost irretrievably in the swamp of hunger, I hide amidst the barren rocks. My name had been a museum piece, heaving my last breath like my dialect, before and after you live streamed my scream. My language is an extant variety of paddy. It isn't sprout on the clay used to sculpt my body. I'm a martyr of my language. Yeah.
Thank you. And now one last question I would want to ask both of you to respond to, and I would want Ali to read a poem in Urdu before you answer to this question. Let me tell you, as two men from two different positions arguing for identity and dealing with poetry and politics, how would you both respond to those groups, those people who can't even voice their identities within your own communities or without the community, who have to be represented and always misrepresented? Now, Ali, please read a poem and then answer this. We are running out of time. There is so much to talk. I also wanted to ask about caste and gender issues and identity and blah, 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 poetry and all. Now we don't have time.
Just so quickly, this poem, Urdu Nazm, was written in 2018. There had been a lot of lynchings. There was the flood in the south, famine drought in certain parts of the country. So it's called Is Saal Hum Eid Manaye Kya? So for those of you who don't speak Urdu, whether we should we be celebrating Eid this year? Is saal hum Eid manaye kya? Is saal hum Eid manaye kya? Har samt to ghurbat chhai hai, dil khauf se ab labrez hain sab, aur zulm ki आंधी आई है. इस साल हम ईद मनाएं क्या? जहनों को दर्द से बांध दिया, आँखों पर पर्दा डाल दिया, पैरों में हिर्स की बेड़ी है, हाथों में खून की मेहंदी है. इस साल हम ईद मनाएं क्या? बेवा की सदा अब कौन सुने, बच्चों की भूख अब कौन सहे, दहकान का दिल भी रोता है, दाने दाने को तरसता है. इस साल हम ईद मनाएं क्या? वो हिंदू है ये मुस्लिम है, इंसान कहाँ हैं खोए हुए, मस्जिद और मंदिर सब हैं भरे, पर दिल खाली हैं सोए हुए. इस साल हम ईद मनाएं क्या? अब ना बोलेंगे, अब यूं ही टुक टुक देखेंगे, ना पूछेंगे ना बोलेंगे, होंठों पर मोहर लगाई है, खामोशी ही रास आई है. इस साल हम ईद मनाएं क्या? आशिक की ख़ता तो मोहब्बत थी, नादार की किस्मत गुर्बत थी, मज़दूर का हासिल मेहनत थी, अखबार नवीस में जुरअत थी. ये सारे ख्वाब ख़याल हुए, अब सब जज्बे पामाल हुए. इस साल हम ईद मनाएं क्या? So the poem was basically the Akhbar Navees was Shujat Bukhari, the Ashiq were the Romeo squad. We had anti-Romeo squads in UP to stop young couples from being together. So it's a political poem also. And I think that your question quickly was.
How do you respond to those?
So for as an academic, in my archive, what's been very interesting is that the oral aspect of poetry, because poetry is composed not to be read, it is composed to be heard, and therefore, as soon as you know a language, you are included in that circle. So if you look at 19th century Delhi, for instance, there are illiterate daily wage laborers who are brilliant poets. And in that space of the mushaira, that aspect of their class identity is for some time at least put aside. And of course, it is presumptuous to say that you can speak of those who don't have a voice. But I think the job of the poet often is exactly to act also as an ambassador, also as a messenger, because often they just reflect what is happening in society. And today it's amazing, you see global kind of, in the CA protests, there's been a poem in Urdu that has been composed on the back of a very famous poem by Mahmoud Darwish in Arabic called Sajjil an Arabi, record that I'm an Arab, because it was about Palestinians in refugee camps and of course the detention centers here and the CAA and so on. Again, people writing about Kashmir, again Chandramohan Bhai has written about Kashmir, about Islamophobia, frisky. I mean, I read it is about Kashmir. Maybe you didn't write it about Kashmir. So it is possible, I think, to give voice to other forms of oppression with the knowledge that you might not completely be able to know what they're going through. But nonetheless, if you recognize oppression for what it is, then you can translate it into some kind of articulation.
Yeah, I like to respond by just one sentence. So there is this question that those who get to speak, they are stealing the voices of those who are not able to speak from within that canon. So I think the often celebrated answer is pass the mic, or something like give voice to them too. That's all. That is, so assume that I'm composing an anthology or whatever that is. Try to decentralize power and give them a voice too. That's the only way out. Yeah, thank you.
And before ending, I would like to read a poem by a transgender poet from Kannada. And her name is Chandini. Chandini's father was Mahadevappa, who threw her out of the house. And she came to Bangalore and lived in a hammam, and she's still in Bangalore. And Chandini's poem, this is the translation of Chandini's poem. It's Ajji's death and Mahadevappa. When Ajji died, unable to answer those around, Appa made a big ruckus, disowning his daughter who wasn't a son, banning me from participating in the death ceremony. My hues and cries failed to knock the door of his heart. It was all about pride of his family lineage. At Appa's death ritual, when I, the daughter, decided to sacrifice my beautiful long hair and shave my head, the family stopped me by opening their arms of acceptance. As Appa wished for a family with no lineage, I became a mother, then a support to my sister.